Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show James Sullivan. James is a fellow podcaster whom I first heard on Thaddeus Russell's show Unregistered. He made a few brief references to Ursula K, which weren't quite picked up on in that exchange, so I thought to myself, the time has come. I'll be having that. And so I did. And so here we are. There is, before we begin, the slight question of whether I need to issue a spoiler warning for classic literature. There certainly are spoils ahead, but I actually don't think they would ruin a first reading for most people, and may even enhance it. Nevertheless, spoilers ahead, and other than that, enjoy. James, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Gordon. How are you?
I'm good. For 7 a.m. on a cold Monday morning in southern Tasmania, I'm doing pretty good.
How cold is cold?
It's single digits, Celsius, obviously. But, when Antarctica is your neighbor, you get half the year like this. But it's kind of pleasant. I like it. We have open fires and all this sort of stuff, which is impossibly exotic when you grew up on the mainland Australia and you're instead taught how not to die in a fire or start them. And then you move down here and you have to learn how to do it.
It is just under 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Texas today.
Right. That actually doesn't sound that much better, I'm not going to lie.
It's not. It's awful. I've been doing a lot of moving, too. So
Right. Well, thank you for your time, as I said, and you're a first-time guest, which means you get the first-time guest traditional question. James, were you a weird kid?
Yes, I was a weird kid. I thought I was normal, or I didn't. I thought I was doing really good at maintaining normality. But the more that I reflect upon my childhood and the kinds of circles of friends where I was within the group, but still kind of outside of that group, I realized that I must have been pretty strange, or at least stranger than I realized.
Strange like you only wore the color blue? Strange like you had a hat with horns?
No, I socialized well. I didn't have any weird quirks. I was always told that my stories went on too long and they didn't have a point, or that my interests were outside of what everybody else was interested in.
And so what were they?
I was interested in, as a kid, cartoons for way too long, probably. And then almost as soon as I discovered it, I became interested in philosophy, which nobody likes.
No, not even now. No, that's a buzzkill. If you wanna quiet down a dinner party, just say, "Hey, let's talk about philosophy."
Actually, I've learned that even among people in academic philosophy, it is taboo to talk about philosophy outside of the context of philosophy. I say, don't bring it up. It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't make us look good.
Well, why do you suppose that is? I have some stringent opinions about modern philosophy and its moribund state now. And I'm of the opinion that the most interesting philosophy that's happened in the last 25 years has been in anthropology. But, why do you suppose that is?
I don't know. I don't think it hinges on any kind of people's discomfort with discussing ideas, because people talk about ideas all the time. Philosophy just tries to pull at the underpinnings of those ideas and maybe delve into them a little deeper. I think a lot of people think it's boring, and depending on the way that we do philosophy, I think that's why. Because if we approach it if we approach an idea very analytically or litigiously, then it's really easy for people to get bored or disinterested.
Do you think I mean, I think that's a fair criticism, but it also seems to me that over its 2,800-year history, at least in the West, it no longer swings for the fences. Like, I think it is actually boring. I think it does do that over-analytical stuff for timid reasons. And this is kind of why I have stringent opinions about it. I don't think... and I found out about you from Thaddeus's podcast, Unregistered, where he got you to talk about postmodernism and such things. And I just kind of... I don't think it has adequately pulled itself out of, and I'm pro-postmodern, but I don't think it's adequately pulled itself out of that rain shadow and is still unnecessarily suspicious of kind of like foundational metaphysics, which is where the interesting stuff happens, I think, at the moment. And because you look at it and think, look at the most prominent ones now, like, I think you would kill yourself if you read all of Alain de Botton's books. Like, I think you would actually die. I think he's a demon. And the best thing...
the process would kill you.
Yeah, it would. And the most perfect thing that ever happened to him was being installed as the official philosopher at Heathrow Terminal 5, because that just said everything about modern philosophy to me, because he doesn't say anything except give you this milquetoast, almost like painkiller to survive and be moderately happy in a neoliberal regime. And you think, this is where it's at. No wonder academic philosophers are ashamed to bring up their work at a dinner party.
And philosophy has given a lot of our authority away. We gave metaphysics to science. We said, have at it. The only field that we seem to, and part of this is because we atomized philosophy into fields of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And so we still have a hold on ethics, and there's some interesting things that are being written about in ethics. It's just nobody reads ethics.
No.
People don't like being told how to live their lives, unless it's by a self-help guru.
Yeah. Do you think there's my impression is it's kind of got itself tangled up in its own fishnet, because when I think about, and I talk to philosophy students, and, you know, if you're studying at a tertiary level, you get the Socratics for better and for worse, and then you kind of leap 1,800 years to Descartes and Kant and Locke and so on, with maybe a wink at St. Anselm and Thomas Aquinas, just to get an idea of the European development of the individual. And it's from there, and they kind of accepted a lot of the, I guess, Enlightenment or Lockean foundational premises, and everything that's sort of come after that. It's range bound itself and hasn't sufficiently interrogated. This is, in fact, my problem with postmodernism, that it hasn't sufficiently interrogated the foundational premises that allow it to exist. And so you get to this point where, if you do that, here's why I think anthropology is in the lead at the moment. After 150 years of being handmaiden to empire, it, about 25 years ago, worked that out and said, well, we need a new way of essentially what De Castro calls anthropology is nothing more than comparing anthropologies, but it's also nothing less. And I think that's a really smart statement. And they have spent the last 25 years working out how you can engage with non-European modes of thought without bringing a European naturalist power structure to it, where you relativize cosmologies and myths and so on. Because if you do that, you're actually encoding that Eurocentric model of reality anyway. And it's an ongoing project, but I think anthropology is 2 decades ahead of philosophy, because philosophy hasn't built that connective tissue adequately, because it's range bound by these ideas. It hasn't built the connective tissue to adequately be informed by non-European modes of thought. And I know a lot of philosophers think that, but it would be good to see some more visible executions of it rather than Alain de Botton.
Yeah. Philosophy has definitely been canonized as Western thought, and the process of kind of decolonizing that and getting Latin American philosophers into the curriculum, or really non-European philosophers into the curriculum, it's almost like you take it as an elective class if you were to take something like that were even offered in the university. But I think that's absolutely critical, because those assumptions that we have are built in to the framework, and that affects the way that we see the whole rest of the history of philosophy. There is a podcast, The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, that attempts to kind of remedy this, where he talks about the history of philosophy, but unlike how you're taught in the university, which is you start with the pre-Socratics, and then you do ancient philosophy, which apparently ends at Aristotle. There's only 3 guys. And then you usually skip medieval philosophy. You might touch on Aquinas. I did. I had one text by Aquinas assigned to me. And you skip over to modern philosophy, which, at least in the American curriculum, we love, because we love Locke, because Locke pretty much wrote our Declaration of Independence. Yeah. We just copied a lot of what he had to say. And it's only if you manage to stick with philosophy, if you don't get bored out of your mind by then, you get into the 4th year and somebody might mention to you, hey, here's a bit of forgotten history. Some of the Declaration of Independence was inspired by Native American ideas. But we don't have that included in our understanding, because Jefferson wasn't allowed to come forward with that information. He wasn't allowed to say, oh, I got this great idea from these tribes we're going to murder in about 50 years. And I forgot where I was going with this, but
I think by then you're still bringing... Oh, sorry, you carry on.
Breaking that canon. So the history podcast, it covers Arabic philosophy, Chinese philosophy, and it goes period by period. And the without any gaps is everything that wouldn't be included in a typical philosophy curriculum.
Yeah, I find that that big medieval gap is interesting to me historiographically, because the premium members would be familiar with this because we've done courses on the history of the grimoires and so on. What tends to happen, although they began as cathedral schools, is for the last couple of centuries, the top universities in the Anglosphere have been in a Protestant environment, and they sort of emerged to prominence at a time when Catholicism was considered superstition. So there's this 1,000-year gap where it said, oh, that's just popery. We don't need that at all. And it's still this bizarre, uneven thing. And with philosophy as well, particularly if you get to, I guess, 4th year and you're trying to engage with non-European modes, if you haven't interrogated the epistemology that you do with that, you're essentially just kind of shopping in a supermarket of ideas, because you make them inert when you bring them into your sphere if you haven't looked at the epistemology that you're using to kind of validate other modes.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to always keep conscious of is that just as our emotions and everything else about us has a particular context and framework to it, I can't guarantee that I will arrive at any conclusion logically, because even my reasoning has its foundations built up by years of assumption.
But if you go, that's half the battle, is to kind of acknowledge that at the start and just sort of be humble before the project, I guess.
Yes.
So is this the kind of
starting point?
Just James bringing it back to you being a weird kid? Was this the kind of stuff that people were saying you talk too much about weird stuff that was happening?
Yeah, I mean, even now, I'll talk to my wife about what movie were we watching. Oh, it was this movie where I can't remember the name of it. This business, like a big corporation, they were all locked inside the building and they had to kill each other to get out. And so at the end of the movie, everyone in the room kind of goes, it was okay. It was an okay movie. And I go, did you guys notice all the different ethical theories? And they go, what? And I said, yeah, this character was like a virtue ethicist. So he didn't murder anybody. And then there were utilitarians in the group. There were more Kantian deontologists in the group. And, you can, like, a couple different of the main characters had their own little ethical mode that they were practicing from. And that affected and every single one of them died. And they go, no. And so I started to explain it to them, and I see the glaze go over their eyes. I'll just forget it.
Yeah. Well, I guess
I liked it too.
Yeah. You're one. At least you waited to the end of the film, because I just have to end this show now. If you said I paused the film and decided to ruin it during the film. Nice one. All right. Well, given, I guess, your interests over the course of... I mean, let's go back to being a kid. I mean, tell me what leaps to mind first as one of the more either transformative or novels or books that left a large or big impression on you as, say, a teenager.
I didn't read as a kid.
Then how did you get weird?
I utterly deprived I wrote. I was a writer.
Okay.
So I'd write a whole bunch, and I'd write stories, or I would. I was very big on. I didn't call it philosophy then, but I would write out arguments. So if I got grounded, I would write a 2-page paper arguing why I should not be grounded, or why I should be ungrounded.
Did that ever work?
No. And in high school, I was in the ROTC, which is like military training for high school students. I don't know if they have it in other countries. It might just be an American military propaganda thing. I don't know. But I wanted to like it because my grandfathers were in the military, so I wanted to honor that legacy or something. And I hated it. I don't do well with authority figures and people telling me what to do and having those decisions be arbitrary. That's what really bothered me. And I ended up writing it was a document, like a declaration. And I taped it, not like Martin Luther. I didn't hammer it to the door of the office, but I did tape it to the door of the office, declaring I don't know. I don't remember what was in it, but I remember going by Cadet X and writing it on there. So I must have just covered Martin Luther in my curriculum.
Very cool. Well, one of the other things I learned from the podcast is that you had a week or multi-week dalliance with your understanding of Taoism at the time because you found a book which kind of piqued my interest, because you and Thaddeus then went on to talk about Ursula K, which we're going to talk about presently. But given the fact that if she was pressed, she would probably say she was a Taoist, although you would have had to have pressed her for that because it was more a thing that she found to be quite enriching. But I thought that was it was an interesting foreshadowing potentially of some of the fiction that may have subsequently resonated with you.
Yeah, I did. So I remember finding that book and in my effort to kind of establish my identity, I was always very concerned with identity when I was a teenager, and not only figuring out who I am, but establishing that who I am must be uniquely different and individual. And so, because absolutely nobody else in my world knew what Taoism was, I thought, I can start here. And the book was really great. It was just a meditations book. You read one every day, and I would sit down and pretend to meditate on the carpet on the floor. And connecting Taoism to Ursula, I think within Earthsea, that definitely makes sense. Because you've read all 6 books, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I've met so many people that are like, "Oh, I love the trilogy," and I go, "No.
No, she kept going.
The last 3 are the best ones."
Ooh.
That's where the arc is.
I don't know. I like The Other Wind. Yeah, I can explain why later, but they're good. They're amazing. Have you read Firelight?
No.
Right, that because I'm pretending to be fancy, I have a Paris Review subscription, and in the summer edition of this year, so I found this interesting because it came out the year she died. There is a 12-page story of Ged's death, and I'll send it to you after we record. But that
I
came
just
out.
Got fucking chills.
Yeah. So there's still a little bit of Earthsea left for you to read, which it's like water in the desert. And for people listening, that's in the summer 2018 Paris Review, and yeah, it's I guess the last thing she would have or will have ever written. And I find that interesting just from a planning of a magazine perspective, because I think she died in February or whatever it was.
I think it was January.
Okay. So they would have been working on, well, the spring one probably would have been put to bed, but probably one of the last things that happened would have been, essentially agreeing that this will come out in the summer edition of Paris Review. And it's interesting. To me, it's interesting she died in the same year, essentially, that Ged did.
That's perfect.
It is.
Just as Ged was done with doing. So
yes.
was she.
Well, let's back this up for people, and I'll get you to describe what even am Earthsea. And you came to it, like I did too, kind of late. Like I first read them in my early 20s. But when did you first read them, and tell people what Earthsea is?
I discovered Earthsea last year, actually. I'm an audiobook, huge fan of audiobooks. I didn't read as a child, but I consume a lot of literature now. I have trouble reading, but which makes philosophy a really difficult field to pursue. And so with Audible, you get 1 free book a month, right? And Earthsea was so fantastic, I bought all of them and listened to them in about 2 months. And then I listened to them again and again and again. I've probably been through Earthsea 8 or 9 times, all the way through. And I was in Earthsea when she died. I remember I was in my car listening, and I stopped and checked my phone and saw that Ursula had passed away. And at that moment, I was in the 4th book with Ged on at the wizard's house where he was tending goats. So Earthsea is a fantasy story about dragons, wizards, kings, and language, I think.
It's interesting you say you're in Earthsea, because we were kind of chatting on Twitter beforehand about Ursula's conceptualization of and what I really, one of the many things I respected about her is she doesn't have that annoying expat faux whimsy that Neil Gaiman does when people are like, well, where do your ideas come from? I say, oh, I make them up. They come from my head. And it's just the dumbest thing. And she has, and I bought, actually, funnily enough, after we'd arranged this, I was in Melbourne the other week, and there is a recently released collection of her like nonfiction and essays called Dreams Must Explain Themselves, which is all right. Like, for people listening, if you're a fan of Ursula, get it, or if you are a writer, get it, but otherwise don't, because they are basically about Earthsea and the writing process. But she has a really, and I respect this, a very mid-20th century Jungian understanding of the ontology of Earthsea, which is like, I didn't make it up, I found it. And I had to go and find other pieces of it piece by piece. And her articulation of it is much better than Tolkien's. But we were kind of talking about what that means, and you were saying she might be a recovering Heideggerian, I guess we would say.
Yes, I think so. So she says in the introduction to one of the Earthsea books, it must have been the fourth one, Tahanu, that's right. She had never planned, no, it's the Tales after the short stories.
Yeah. In the back,
she says in the intro, yeah. She said, I didn't plan on the book being a trilogy, which is why she wrote the fourth book, and she arrogantly said, the last book of Earthsea. And she goes, oh, I was so foolish. And she had to, I think her exact language was, I went back and saw everything that had been happening since I was gone. And she wanted to tell us about it. So she imagines it as a place in itself that she visits. And I think that's really important for readers to understand that it's a place that we can visit as well.
Yeah. Well, describe how that, because I know you're, and this is where one of the many things that I think postmodernism needs a postmodern treatment, just as an aside. But describe how you conceptualize that. One. Yeah, describe how you conceptualize that, because I really do. I come at it from, I guess, an occult perspective, which is I am extremely cynical of any cosmology that sort of fails to account for consciousness at the beginning, and that's a big problem for any of the kind of 20th century. They just sort of leap over the fact that we are thinking, and not in a Cartesian sense. There's just no adequate model for it, and then it gets relativized and tabula rasa, and it's a mess. But like, describe what that means to you. The fact that it is a place we can visit, that she considered had a kind of actual like ontological fixity, I guess, or stability. Probably is the word I'm looking for. Like, am I visiting the same Earthsea? Is I guess another way of describing that question.
Ooh. I think so. I don't think that Ursula would, because she was an anarchist, I don't think she would stake claim on something that isn't hers, and I don't think she ever saw Earthsea as something that was hers and hers alone. It was something that she wrote about. What was the other story? The Flyers of Pi, maybe? LeVar Burton just did a reading on this book, a short story of hers, where she talks about, she's writing about a place as like a journalist would, but she's telling the story. And I think that's most of what her writing is an exploration of a place that we can all visit. And that's important because Ursula was very much the kind of person that was concerned with social change, and that begins with the imagination. So for her, and yeah, I'd say for me too, the places that we visit in Earthsea are as much ours because they are contained within the imagination.
Yeah, it swings on how you... essentially, it swings on your theory of mind. Because I agree. I think it is, as I said, there's a sort of Red Book Jung rather than depth psychology Jung is generally my map for how I consider the unconscious and the imaginal and so on. So I think it is... I think something happened in the late 19th to mid 20th century that might be like an antibody reaction to the essentialist, transcendental, ethno-nationalist version of Northern European thinking. I think there was like an antibody reaction in the dreamscape because we sort of end up with Lord of the Rings and then, Earthsea and so on. And it just seems very fascinating to me that there are, from a Jungian perspective, you can kind of go, well, these forms are, at the time, appear closer to the surface, if that makes sense. And that sort of happened historically if you look at Elizabeth I and the sort of idea that this form or archetype of a fairy queen with Spencer and Dee and the queen herself and whatever, kind of close to the surface, is something I find fascinating that in a way it's unprecedented that these forms are there and when you encounter them, this has been my experience anyway, maybe 5 times in your life you encounter real worlds, like there's the one you live in. And then you'll read through books, and there's just something, the mouthfeel of Middle Earth or Earthsea or whatever is like this. I can't shake this. It's literally broken my mind because I need to think myself how I make. I need a definition of why this is real and why other things aren't. And it's just one of those fascinating transformative things that when you hit good fantasy, it should break your mind.
Lord of the Rings didn't do that for me, but Earthsea definitely has. The Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin has also done that. I encountered that world, which is very real, recently. If you haven't read that, I highly recommend them. And the audiobooks are fantastic as well.
Yeah, I'm an Audible nerd myself, so I'll put that on the list. It's nothing quite like
They're really great.
So, going back to Earthsea then, like, describe your impression of the philosophy that's sort of, I don't want to say peeking through, that seems too timid, but describe your impression of Ursula's philosophy as she explores it in Earthsea, I guess.
So, she builds, what I like about the way that Ursula wrote her philosophy into Earthsea was that, not like other novelists that are philosophers like Dostoevsky or something, there isn't just a monologue where they tell you the whole philosophy in like a Randian sense or something. It's subtle and you have to find it. But through its subtlety, it doesn't stand out in a way that you can ignore it. And what caught me first was the language. So I'm really big on philosophy of language. It's something that I really enjoy. And in Earthsea, we have this essentialist notion of being, that all things have their true being, and you can know it and call to it once you know the name of its being, which captures its essence. And I found that fascinating to start, just as like a framework for how magic would work. Like, that makes sense. Of course, we would call it magic. We would on this earth, because we don't have anything like that we can't know the true essence of a thing. And if we could, that would be magical. But what caught me was the conversation with, when Geb was in school, his first year, talking to the master namer. The master namer is describing how names are the games of this language, where the sea that's called Inian is known as the inmost sea, but it can't mean just that, because you can't call it, the name Inian is not the sea, it is all sea, or all seas but the inmost sea. But it can't mean that either, because contained within those other bodies of water are all these bays and straits and other things that have names in their own selves. So even our essence contains with it some kind of context. It's always in reference to another thing. And I thought that was, and she didn't have to put that in there to make the world magical or interesting. And she didn't put that in there for me, obviously, but she built that in, and I thought that was absolutely fantastic as a way of understanding our mode, even our very essence is connected to another in some way. And that's also built in very much to our anarchism that we see in the Dispossessed and parts of Earthsea. Then I got interested because she started talking about death. And because I've been reading a lot of Derrida lately, I've also been learning a lot about Heidegger, because Derrida doesn't exist without Heidegger. And I had this idea.
Just explain that for people. Initially. Just explain why. You have one sentence, James.
Derrida's work is very much built upon the work of Heidegger and Husserl, Edmund Husserl. So Derrida does not stand alone. He stands in reference to Heidegger and others. His work is,
which is a very Derridaian notion.
Yes, it's his work is very important to me. I find it very fascinating, but his work doesn't stand alone, which is unfortunate, because I would like to only read Derrida, but in order to understand Derrida, sometimes you have to read about 20 more books. So then we started talking about death, and because Ged has to confront his death, not once, he has to confront it 3 times, I think. I haven't read that. Wonder how that last piece. Don't spoil it for me.
I won't, I promise.
But so he has to confront his death. It
turns out he was a ghost the whole time. Sorry, James.
I actually did have, I'll tell you in a minute. So he has to confront his death in the first book. And we can, if I were to summarize Heidegger, which would be a good thing to do so that you don't have to read him, I would say that his entire project on being is concerned with the apprehension of death, and that the prime mode, not primal, for being, which he called Dasein, is a being towards death, which is a confrontation with death, where you understand that your death is certain, and that you confront and realize that in a effective way, so that you can live your best life, rather than living in fear of death or avoiding death, which is the worst. And that, I think, also builds into more of an Eastern religion understanding of death, that it is a certainty, and that you should know and understand that in the context of your life, which is what death is. It's the context of your life. Your life only has meaning because it will end. So he has to confront it there, and he confronts it again with the king, Lebanon, in the third book. The whole third book, I think, is about death.
Oh, absolutely. That's why it's my favorite. I love it. But
it's very good.
Like Wizard of Earthsea, though, it's interesting. I saw the influence of a different Central European. Like she even uses Jungian terms. Like Ged individuates in the first book. Like he absorbs his shadow by recognizing that its true name is his true name, and sort of after breaking it. Like it seems like a classic depth psychology process to me, because at that point he has the sort of whole humanness to carry on with his life. But I saw a different Central European influence there.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I haven't read a lot of Jung. I don't have him. His writing isn't on the forefront of my mind when I'm interpreting texts.
Sure.
So I wish I could ask her, but
yeah. Anyway, carry on, because I want to talk about the other Win, because I think her treatment of death from a magical perspective is unbelievably profound and wise, like I haven't seen articulated anywhere else ever in fiction.
Right. So we learn by the time we get to the other Win, we learn that we have to confront death, and now the whole totality of Earthsea has to confront death at once, and we learn that this wall that we hear about for 5 books now, about where your soul goes after you die, is not an afterlife. It is I guess I would describe it as like a purgatory, or a place built by a magical barrier. And we learn from the ones who have been completely otherized in these stories, the Kargish, that that's an artificial postponement of death. That death is a recycling of our life. We're supposed to die and be buried, and then what you what's the word? I can't remember that goddamn word with an R.
Reincarnation?
That's it. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
You're sort of reincarnated.
Because I found it beautiful and horrifying, and for me, so for people listening who haven't read the books, there's some cosmology of Earthsea into it to do with the fact that humans and dragons were once the same thing, and the humans sort of broke up a very ancient compact when the dragons went west and they started to do magic and pursue power and things they didn't want to do, and the wizards built this sort of ersatz afterlife, this sort of artificial dry lands where, and again, there's a psychological angle here where essentially that fear of death means that they sustain their ego, or these sort of shade versions of a human after it has died, and it's a fear response. And the book is essentially reversing this really, and I just, it's so wise, and I'll tell you why it, I guess, impacts people with an understanding of Western magic in particular. There are a bunch of different formulae over the last 1800 years that essentially do that, and I look at it and I see the fear response of the people who wrote things like the Abramelin or whatever. You see this idea of not wanting to, or being unsure of and afraid in front of what happens, like that confrontation of death. So the sort of building of this synthetic afterlife, and it's horrifying in a way that is deeply affecting to read through. It's why it's my favorite. I think the actual wisdom contained in and bravery in what actually happens in that book is just so good.
Yeah, one of the things that Derrida has to say about death, building off of a being towards death, is that death gives us our sole responsibility. That sole responsibility is a confrontation with death. It's the only thing that I myself am irreducibly responsible for. And we see in the final book how the building of that wall and the making of the dry land has excused everybody from that responsibility. Yeah. And so it's what happens at the end is that everybody is responsible for taking it down.
And that's an anarchist, animist position right there. It's I think when you were talking about her politics in the books, Earthsea. If you live in Earthsea, you understand it. It's I mean I like the Dispossessed and I like Left Hand of Darkness and so on, but she's using science fiction in those cases for its sort of original purpose, which is almost as a polemic. So in some respects, the politics is quite clunky. Same thing, which I think is the best title for a book ever. Like The Word for World is Forest is the same sort of like it emerges from Vietnam and trying to understand like non-European.
I just got that book.
Yeah,
I just got it on Audible. I haven't listened to it yet.
It's good, but it's in the kind of Dispossessed left-hand area where it's a bit heavy-handed with. Like it hasn't aged quite as well, put it that way. It's still good. I like it, but there's nothing. Earthsea is just one of those moments. I was saying, you know, maybe it didn't. Middle Earth didn't resonate for you, but there is something about the depth of it that means that I'm not even sure how in control of it she was, and so you get this kind of cosmic explorations of her philosophy and politics in a way that the Dispossessed it's much more polemical. Still good, but polemical.
Yeah, I'm working back through the Dispossessed. I really liked it, but I like it in contrast to the Culture series by Ian Banks. I like comparing those kinds of anarchist worlds and seeing the importance of the difference between the two. But I think the reason that Earthsea it really stands alone is that she, the world building is so not complete, but fulfilling. That the mission of the book was to tell a story and to create a place that you could be as well. The Dispossessed perhaps had a different agenda when she wrote it.
Well, it's exploring something more shallow, and I don't mean this in a negative way. It's exploring mere politics in a way that there's something cosmic about. So one of the definitions of an archetype is something that's sort of infinitely deep or infinitely expanding, and it's a thing that this is how I think you can tell when you're in a real realm, whether it's Middle Earth or Earthsea or so on, because as you say, world building isn't even right. Like it might be cartography or something, but
yeah. That sounds more accurate.
Yeah, but you don't. Even if the description,
she had to redo the maps.
Yeah, true. But even if the descriptions are sparse and it's a quote-unquote young adult fiction, you don't feel the sparseness, you feel the infinite depth. Like you can see and feel the islands that they sail past that they never visit, and that is the kind of difference, I think, for me. It's The Dispossessed feels like a novel, good novel, but it feels like a novel. That Earthsea is infinitely deep, I guess, is what I was going with.
Yeah, I agree.
Cool. So let's. I mean, we can talk about the towers. And you said there's. I get it now. What you were saying, like she's possibly was a recovering Heideggerian, at least with the first book. But do you see any of as much of maybe the Taoism, her interest in Taoism in there, or do you think there's other more prominent, I guess, philosophical influences or explorations in Earthsea?
I think with regards to, by the time we get to The Other Wind, she has, I could no longer credibly argue that she was a Heideggerian in any sense. And she might not have even read Heidegger. The thing is that around the time that Heidegger was writing his big piece of work, Being in Time, there was a sort of emergence of Eastern thought into what we call Western philosophy. And one of the things about postmodern philosophy is that Eastern philosophy figured it out about 2,000 years before they did. And they've been doing stuff with it ever since. So, go ahead and have to abandon my Heideggerian. But for the first three books, I think it's true.
Okay, well, let's talk about the potentially least loved, but I actually think it's quite good. Tombs of Atuan. Le Guin said
I really loved.
Yeah, me too. Le Guin said it was about sex, and when you were trying to explain it to a increasingly less interested Thaddeus, I don't think fantasy fiction is his thing.
I don't think so either.
Yeah, you have some. You had some other interesting takes on it. So, what do you think Tombs of Atuan is about? What impressed you? Let's do it that way. What thoughts emerged from encountering Tombs of Atuan?
Yeah. When I listened to Tombs of Atuan, I did a podcast episode about it for my podcast, and when I was starting to do some research on what other people wrote about Tombs of Atuan, I discovered that the book was about sex. I didn't pick that up at all. That's partially because that's just a blind spot for me. It's not something that I like with the Jungian thing. It's just not something that's on the forefront of my mind, so it's not within my interpretation usually.
Also, you're not a woman.
Tombs of Atuan.
I think it's specifically about sex from a woman's perspective. And I actually think it's the best fictional depiction of, however problematic this term is, the patriarchy ever. Like, I think that's why it's about sex for Ursula. But anyway, carry on.
I actually think that the arc of the Earthsea stories is about patriarchy.
Yeah,
that's why we see the change in the because what we end up doing is we smash the patriarchy with the island of Roke, and the male wizards, and all of their power, and how they not only clung to their system of power and ostracization of women, but they've forgotten history of how women built the magical world that they live in.
The treatment of women's magic over the first four books, where you first encounter the witch, who's the kind of unauthorized user of true speech in Wizard of Earthsea, but by the time you get to Tahanu and you meet Moss and so on, yes, this it's really potent. I hate using these words because they're such lamps for people to misinterpret it, but there is a sort of feminist empowerment in the unfolding exploration of woman's magic and the witch in these books that, yes, when you hold it up against the structural organization of reality by the all-male wizards of Roke, she's so dangerous and subversive because you're just reading these fantasy books and all of a sudden you get... I think Tombs of Atuan is probably a really good depiction of patriarchy from a sex perspective, because from birth, this girl is told how to be, and her life is in service of these sort of empty rituals and dead things that probably aren't even there. And she has to work that out. Like, well, wait a minute. Why are we doing
an empty throne?
Yeah, why are we doing all this stuff? Why are we? And the answer she gets is like, well, because we've always done this. And I'm like, no, that's not good enough. And so there's that kind of sexual encounter, perhaps, with the patriarchy in Tombs of Atuan. But it's she's so, what I loved about her and still love about her is she's so politically dangerous in a quiet way. And you get to the end of the books and it's amazing.
It's no coincidence, I think, that Ged's first teacher was a woman, and that his master's teacher, O'Jaim, his teacher was a woman too, or his teacher's teacher was a woman.
Interestingly, because I've only read them and not listened to the audiobooks. So in the audiobooks, it's pronounced O'Jaim, because in my head, it's always been Ogion. So I learned something.
I've actually, they switch narrators halfway through from a male to a female in the later books. And I've heard it both ways.
Phew. All right. Because I hate having to correct my internal narrator once I fixed on something.
I once in a philosophy class, because I had only read the word, I said Descartes.
Oh no!
Out loud. Oh yes. To second and third year philosophy students, and was met with the kindest professor who nodded and repeated what I said, but correctly.
I would have fallen into a hole.
That's how I learned. It's Descartes. I don't read French. How was I supposed to?
I mean, some of the other stuff that's in it that I find, the people maybe, this is why she's quietly dangerous. Her reformulation of the entire, I guess, Western fantasy canon is not just along gender lines. You don't really notice until probably Tombs of Atuan that the denizens of Earthsea, for the main, are brown. They have like First Nation skin color, and in fact, the bad guys, like in the Kargish side, that's when you get the Nordic ones. And it's really, she does these tricky things, because when you engage with fantasy fiction, you do assume it is a kind of Hitler wet dream to start with. That's the default thing, and she will kind of just subtly puts it in there that in fact, no, they're brown. That's just how it is. And it's not even, it doesn't bang the drum on it anywhere. You just notice the difference in skin color once Ged gets to, once Ged encounters Tenar and all that kind of stuff, you see that there's, and I just think that's the kind of stuff that made her a master.
Yeah. She said when she wrote Tahanu, that she had come up against some struggle or some backlash, because she had dealt with the canon of race, which is she swapped the roles where the white people are the evil. But in Tahanu, she started messing with gender roles as well, and she received even greater backlash than the racial.
You see her struggle with it. I've been on a couple of shows talking about Ursula over the last 6 months, and she wrote that she felt a bit guilty after Tombs of Atuan, because obviously Ged gets a rough treatment in that book, and she kind of realized that was her anger at herself for defaulting to the fantasy trope, like that it had to be a man, as the central character, like boy wizard goes off, learns, has his individuation journey or whatever. And it was really interesting to hear her say that I think I was unnecessarily cruel to Ged, because it wasn't actually his fault. And she does end up, although I won't tell you what happens in Firelight, but by the time you get to Tahanu, she's realized that Ged is a victim of this structure in his own way as well, and so that he
really had to fight that struggle in Tahanu.
Absolutely,
to discover who he was all over again. And it was painful for him and painful for those around him.
It's the book of the original four that in some respects I understand or resonate with the least, but I have a sneaking suspicion as I age I will resonate with it more, because it before we hit the record button, we were talking about that being and doing exploration, and the fact that Ged is essentially trying to, like, Ged and all of them are reconsidering what an authentic life is, and whether it's in that kind of pursuit of power, and if they want that. There's this, almost like a "that is no country for old men" angle to it, but looking at what an authentic life is and the difference between being and doing. I think it's another one of those really subversive books that, like, who wouldn't want to be Archmage? And apparently Ged. And he's right.
Yeah, his for me, in the fourth book, he discovers that his identity was always in the context of his power and in the context of magic. And what does he have now that he's given that up? And all he has is, all he has is himself, but his self in reference to others.
So there's another, well, if true speech has invites a Derrida interpretation, there's a sort of Foucault interpretation, or invitation to a Foucauldian interpretation of how Ged formulates his identity there too.
Yeah, I think so. Oh, I never answered your question about what I thought Tombs of Atuan was about.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I thought that Tombs of Atuan was about political power, because there's very much a political structure established, but it's all built upon empty ritual. The tombs are empty, the caves are empty, the throne is empty, and the practitioners continue to practice these empty rituals based on the rules of their political structure. And so Tombs of Atuan, for me, raised the question of what kinds of political practices do we do out of habit that are empty or meaningless, because whenever that power is, would that power allow itself to be questioned by any sort of regular practice? And the answer is no. Sort of like the anarchist notion that democracy will never let you vote itself away. They'll never let you vote to have an absolute freedom. So I tried to explore that. And once I looked at the sex angle, I went, oh yes, it's also very obviously about sex. I just hadn't picked up on that interpretation.
Well, again, I think it's very much sex from a woman's perspective, and her, like a 14-year-old girl discovering the alienness and difference of males, because she's been caught in this structure about essentially how, in her case, one woman, but how a woman is supposed to believe, and the sort of the ambivalence and subsequent wisdom of, at the very end, when she does in fact escape with Ged and she thinks about cursing him to sort of blame him for it, and she's like, actually, no. And I it's just, yeah, it's a remarkable exploration. I think it's the one because it's so different to the rest of them in terms of location. I mean, people want to go to Earthsea for Earthsea. They want islands and boats and all that kind of stuff. I think it's the one that is...
And they want the magic.
Yeah, and that's
and there's
not
no
there.
Magic.
Yeah. It's just one of those crazy, like, this is what I mean, that quiet subversion. It's like, so Wizard of Earthsea was very popular. It's like, let's have a sequel that is nothing at all like no magic, no islands, no water. Yeah, it's just that potency. I mean, I want to kind of close with your read on her vision of things like fantasy, because it comes back to, or it speaks to how she conceived of what these worlds are. Now, there's an oft quoted, to the point that I find mildly frustrating, thing that she says in that essay about why Americans are scared of dragons. There's this line, people who don't believe in dragons are often eaten by dragons from the inside. So, like, what's she saying?
That does sound very Jungian.
I think so. I think it's funny enough, this book that I just got, Dreams Must Explain Themselves, the main essay in that, which has the same title, is... So the Red Book was only published about 10 years ago, or made available 10 years ago, even though Jung wrote it almost a century ago, or compiled it almost a century ago. And that was by design, because he was trying to make psychology and depth psychology and his whole process look legitimate and an approximation, like look science-ish. So you can't have him going, like, building towers and going on this astral journey and talking to, church fathers and flaming dragons in trees and all this kind of stuff. Put that to the side. And it took a while for it to pull out. So when this essay, Dreams Must Explain Themselves, came out, I think the book's somewhere near me, but it came out in the 70s. I think it was about 73. And I'll be damned if she isn't, and she couldn't know this, if she isn't basically describing what Jung did in the compiling of the Red Book and it's something Tolkien would say when he needed to, like, if he needed to find new words, or he wasn't sure what a word was in one of his languages, he'd say, I must find out. So it wasn't like, I need to invent this. He's like, I need to go and find out. And it's just interesting to me that Ursula is basically describing her process of uncovering Earthsea looks very similar to Jung's compilation of the Red Book, which I appreciate you haven't read.
Ursula was always concerned with a radical imagination. And I'm not sure what her beliefs on it, but based on at least this conversation, it seems that the imagination is not an invention. It's not something that we create, but more like something we conjure. And so we know from Earthsea that conjuring and summoning is one of the most dangerous kinds of magic. And she was very careful in bringing Earthsea to us, or at least creating the portals through which we could visit ourselves. As a world itself, I just think it's so great. It has so much in it that she didn't even, she wasn't even conscious of. And most of the stuff that I pulled from Earthsea, Ursula had no consciousness of writing about it.
But that's based on your encounter in Earthsea. That's your experience of Earthsea. So it has that legitimacy to it.
And that's why I think it's so important that she didn't create a building that we can go and visit, like a museum. She created a space for us to explore. And as someone who's concerned with social change and radical imagining, I think the most beneficial thing that we can do is find ways to discover space to do that kind of work. And Earthsea is one of those spaces that we can do it in.
I want to pick up on two things there, which again I just sort of learned from this book. It might be worth picking up, is that she was careful about, because she was aware of the potency of it, she was careful about providing entry or portals for us into Earthsea. She took it very seriously, and that's why, she kind of ate some humble pie about, this is the last Earthsea book. It's like, wow, wait, it's not done with me, and we're not done with it. But that radical imagining, I think, and you correctly used the R word, because it is that. in the sort of politically defined sense. She spent decades, and I've got your opinion on this. She spent decades fighting against this Cartesian materialist theory of mind that, which again is where I think there's a sort of permanent break between her cosmology and most postmodernism, which inherits that kind of Kantian tabula rasa, which is the opposite of what she's saying when it comes to, like, these forms predate her. It's very Jungian, like, ideas have people rather than people have ideas, right? But she says, when, like, the thing that she would land on and crush is any intimation that fantasy was escapism. And that's the radical part.
Yeah.
That's the actual radical imagining. Because she says in, I think it's called Escape Routes, it's a really good essay, you can probably find it online, the direction of escape is toward freedom. So why are you shitting on this? You idiots. Like, that was, C.S. Lewis said something similar, like, do you know who hates escape the most? Jailers.
Yeah.
And, like,
I think I've read that quote before. I think a Twitter account I follow that just posts anarchy quotes has quite a few Le Guins in the bag. Yeah, I mean, the purpose of fiction entirely is escapism, and it's absolutely important for us to imagine a different and better world if we're ever to achieve it. It's even a better world. It can be freedom. The same world, but better.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's just that it is the jailer's trap. And here's the thing that I find annoying and I guess fascinating about the hierarchy of fiction is, in some sense, the ones that can best approximate our waking experience of this sort of late capitalist world are somehow like better or more accurate. And you go, no, it's binary, right? Once you're in fiction, once you're in this imaginal realm, you're in this realm. And like, if you want to swim at the polluted shallow end of it that approximates the realm you just left, go for it. But don't pretend that that is in any way superior. Once you're in your head, essentially, you're in your head. And I that's the radical part of the imagining is so important because, as you say, like, and the words are perfect. The direction of escape is toward freedom. So, as you say, it's how you imagine better worlds is you go in that direction. She doesn't say we all move to Earthsea. She says the direction of escape is towards freedom. And it's in this process that we do have those better ideas and we do potentially transform the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't think of a better place to close.
Nice.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, so I really enjoyed this. Obviously, talking about Earthsea is always a good time. For people who want to know more about yourself, I mean, you're going through on your own show, talking about different aspects of the books and postmodern philosophy and so on. So lay that on people, James, where they can find out more.
They can follow me on Twitter or Facebook at James Giant Pod. My podcast is called James and the Giant Podcast. It Great is not name, a weekly podcast. Thank you. My friend came up with it. I was going to name it Idiosophy or something, which is a idiot and philosophy put together.
No,
anyway, I got talked out of that.
Yeah, this is way better.
I've done 2 episodes. I covered The Wizard of Earthsea and The Tombs of Atuan. I've just done 2 episodes covering Derrida, and in the middle of the second one, I cover The Farthest Shore, at least a little bit, because I'm talking about death and responsibility. Upcoming, I have a podcast about Le Guin and space anarchy.
Cool.
And what space anarchy is, what it could look like if we don't let Elon Musk in.
Exactly. Someone who needs to be eaten by dragons. Yeah.
Someone who needs to be eaten by dragons.
Well, all right. Yeah, go on.
That's it.
Cool. Well, this will, of course, be in the show notes for everyone listening along. And once again, James, thank you very much for some good Earthsea chat.
Gordon, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Well, that was a good chat. It was fascinating to get something of a rogue philosophical interpretation of Earthsea and hold it up against my own more Jungian, more reality of journeying interpretation. And I don't think I'm done with Ursula yet. All her touch points, the role of fantasy, theory of mind, that sort of subversive anarcho-pacifist transformation, they, at least it seems to me, get more relevant rather than less as the days go on. If you haven't read the books yet, let me just say I envy you that first time. They are certainly something to bump to the top of the pile on the nightstand, given the prevailing conditions. Anyway, if you'd like to know more, be sure to check out some of James's Le Guin episodes, details in the show notes. Subscribe to this show in your favorite podcatcher, on Spotify or on YouTube. Find us at runesoup.com or the RuneSoup Facebook page. And find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.